The steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the living room echoed through the house, accentuating the slow, heavy passage of time. I sat quietly in the beige armchair, my gaze drawn to the window. The gray sky, typical of a Wednesday afternoon in Connecticut, perfectly mirrored my mood. The bare, skeletal trees and the rows of identical houses stretched out, all tinged with a pervasive, inescapable sadness. Tonight, I would turn 45. In this large, empty house, I would celebrate my birthday alone, enveloped in a profound loneliness. 45. The number reverberated in my mind like a death knell for my youth and dreams. My life, like the landscape outside, was now cloaked in monotony and muted tones. David, my husband, a successful lawyer, was, as always, absorbed in his work. He left the house before sunrise and returned long after I'd drifted off to sleep. Our conversations had dwindled to perfunctory exchanges and trivial updates. I felt like a passenger on a train with no destination, sitting beside a companion who had become a stranger. Loneliness seeped into every corner of my soul, like a fine layer of dust, silently coating every beautiful emotion. In an effort to fill the emptiness, I turned to the internet. One afternoon, while aimlessly surfing the web, I stumbled upon a lingerie ad. The image of a model with flowing brown hair and a captivating smile, draped in a ruby-red silk set, flashed across the screen like a spark igniting my senses. The red was vibrant, seductive, and bold, a stark contrast to the dreary atmosphere that enveloped my life. The lingerie, with its delicate lace and daring cuts, stirred within me a strange feeling, a mix of anticipation and longing. A sudden thought flashed through my mind, a beacon in the darkness. I wanted it. Without hesitation, I clicked the order button. A few days later, a plain brown package arrived. I picked it up, feeling the same nervous excitement as a child receiving a secret Christmas present. I hid it in the back of my dresser drawer, as if concealing a secret I wasn't yet ready to confront. It wasn't until Friday afternoon, when David was away on a business trip, that I dared to take it out. Opening the package, the soft red silk shimmered in the fading afternoon light. The deep crimson, almost burgundy, resembled blood flowing through veins, like an ember glowing deep within. I gently picked it up, feeling the smooth, cool fabric slide across my fingertips. The black lace, as delicate as a spider's web, only amplified the alluring charm. I stood before the mirror, gazing at my reflection for a long moment. My face was pale. The lines etched around my eyes and on my skin were more pronounced in the dim light. But as I slipped into the lingerie, I felt a transformation. The silk clung to my body, accentuating curves I thought time had forgotten. My waist seemed trimmer, my legs longer, and the reflection in the mirror was different. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. The doorbell rang, shattering the private moment. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of anticipation and anxiety washing over me. I quickly threw on my bathrobe, smoothed my hair, and went to answer the door. Standing there was Chris. He stood bathed in the late afternoon sun, taller and more imposing than I remembered. The last time I'd seen Chris was at Christmas last year, when he was still a lanky college student with wire-rimmed glasses. But now the glasses were gone, replaced by bright, intelligent brown eyes and a confident smile. His slightly tousled dark hair had a few strands clinging to his forehead, likely from the humidity. Chris wore a simple white t-shirt and jeans, looking effortlessly attractive. "Hi, Aunt Sarah," he said, his voice deep and warm, yet full of youthful energy. "Uncle David asked me to pick up a few things he left behind last week." His gaze met mine, then flickered down to the thin bathrobe I was wearing. I froze for a split second, trying to conceal my rising panic. The flimsy silk robe, my only covering, suddenly felt utterly inadequate. I felt heat rush to my face, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hi, Chris," I stammered, my voice strained with tension. Come in." I instinctively stepped back, intending to usher Chris directly to the garage where David's belongings were stored, desperate to avoid him seeing me like this. I turned quickly, heading down the hallway towards the garage, Chris close behind. Just a few steps in, a sharp tug from behind made me jump. "What the?" I thought, before realizing my robe had snagged on the doorknob. A wave of panic washed over me as I fumbled to free it, my trembling fingers trying to unhook the snagged button. But with each frantic tug, it only tightened. Then, with a small ping, the button gave way, popping off and hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp click, taking the silken robe with it. I stood there, paralyzed, completely exposed in the damned ruby-red lingerie. The vibrant red silk clung to my body, the intricate black lace a bold design against my pale skin, accentuating every curve. The late afternoon light streaming in from the doorway illuminated my figure, the outline of my body clear through the thin fabric. Time seemed to stop. I felt 100 eyes boring into me. I looked up at Chris. He was frozen, his eyes wide, taking in the sight of me from head to toe. His face flushed a deep crimson, a complex expression flickering across his features. Shock, confusion, and something akin to admiration. My face burned with shame. I wanted to disappear into the floor. We stood there in stunned silence, neither of us daring to speak. The air crackled with tension and awkwardness. In a flurry of panic, I bent down, my hands shaking as I grabbed the fallen robe, clutching it tightly to my body. I'm so sorry," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what else to say. This was completely unplanned. I felt utterly foolish, mortified. But at the same time, deep down, a strange, unsettling flicker of excitement stirred within me. After Chris had gathered his things and left, the moment the door clicked shut behind him, I leaned against it, taking a deep breath. My heart was still racing. A mix of embarrassment, excitement, and something undefinable lingered within me. I glanced down at the red silk still clinging to my skin, a self-conscious smile playing on my lips. I quickly changed, but the feel of the soft fabric against my skin remained, like a lingering whisper of a small secret. The next few days passed strangely. I felt as though a tiny spark had been ignited in my otherwise monotonous life. Chris started dropping by more often, finding all sorts of excuses to visit. Sometimes he needed to borrow a wrench. Other times he'd ask about a book David had once read. But I knew deep down these reasons were just pretexts. Our brief conversations gradually grew longer. We talked about everything from our favorite movies to childhood memories. Chris told me about his future plans, about the struggles of finding a job after graduating college. He possessed a kind of enthusiasm and optimism that I had long since lost. I listened to him, and for the first time in years, I felt a genuine connection with someone. One afternoon, while Chris was helping me fix a wobbly bookshelf, he suddenly asked, "Aunt Sarah, do you like to read?" "I do," I replied, slightly surprised. "I used to read all the time, but not so much lately." "Why don't you join the book club at the town library? I heard they're reading The Great Gatsby," Chris suggested, looking at me with a gentle smile. An idea sparked in my mind. "Maybe I should," I said, a flicker of enthusiasm in my voice. From then on, our encounters weren't limited to brief exchanges. We began exchanging books, sharing our thoughts on the characters and plots. Chris even introduced me to a few indie bands he liked, and I was surprised to find that I enjoyed them too. Casual texts and short conversations gradually deepened. I began to look forward to his messages, his smiles. Every time my phone vibrated, my heart skipped a beat. I knew I shouldn't be feeling these things, but I couldn't stop them. Chris was like a breath of fresh air in my stagnant life, bringing back feelings I thought I'd lost forever. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed. A text message from Chris. "Aunt Sarah, I'd like to take you out for coffee, just as a thank you for everything you've done for me." I froze, the spoon in my hand clattering to the floor. The invitation sent my heart racing. I knew the invitation was more than just a casual coffee between an aunt and her nephew. It carried a different weight, almost a clear expression of Chris's intentions. I knew I shouldn't, but a small voice inside me urged me to accept. I looked out the window. Darkness had enveloped the garden. A mix of excitement, anxiety, and a touch of guilt washed over me. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed, "Okay, Chris, thank you." I spent the better part of the afternoon agonizing over what to wear for this coffee date. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but I wanted everything to be perfect. I finally settled on a simple navy blue knit dress paired with brown suede ankle boots. I applied light makeup, just a touch of mascara and lip gloss. I gave myself one last look in the mirror, trying to push down the rising tide of nervousness. When I walked into the daily grind, the rich aroma of roasted coffee and freshly baked pastries filled the air. The cafe had a cozy, inviting atmosphere, with exposed brick walls, small wooden tables, and worn leather sofas. Soft, warm lighting created an intimate and friendly space. I scanned the room for Chris and spotted him sitting in a quiet corner by a large window overlooking the street. He was wearing a gray sweater and jeans, looking casual, yet undeniably handsome. As he saw me, Chris stood up, a bright smile spreading across his face. "Aunt Sarah, you're here," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "Hi, Chris," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We ordered coffee and pastries, and then we began to talk. Chris told me about the challenges of finding a job, the failed interviews, and the flickering embers of hope. I listened to him, feeling a deep sense of empathy. I'd also experienced difficult periods in my career, but I'd never shared those struggles with David. He was always too preoccupied with his own work to have time to listen to my worries. My evenings with David were usually spent in silence, each of us lost in our own worlds. He'd be glued to the TV screen, while I'd passively read a book or surfed the web. We were like two strangers living under the same roof. But tonight was different. Chris listened to me attentively, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own reflections. We talked about everything from our favorite books to current events. I felt heard, understood, a feeling I'd long forgotten. As Chris spoke about his dreams, about wanting to start his own graphic design company, his eyes lit up with passion. I looked at him, and I felt a sense of freshness, an energy I'd forgotten I possessed. Chris's youth and enthusiasm were like a breath of fresh air in my stagnant life, awakening dormant emotions. I suddenly realized I was smiling, a genuine smile, from the heart. I hadn't felt this lighthearted in a very long time. The feeling of loneliness and emptiness seemed to have vanished, replaced by a sense of warmth and comfort. When the evening ended, Chris walked me home. Standing at my front door, he said, "Thank you for tonight, Aunt Sarah. I really enjoyed it." "Me too, Chris," I replied, a soft smile gracing my lips. As the door closed behind me, I leaned against it, closing my eyes. The image of Chris, his smile, his voice, all remained vivid in my mind. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, but I couldn't stop my heart. The small spark had been ignited, and I didn't know if I could extinguish it. Another day, as night fell, the rain began to fall heavily, drumming against the eaves. Chris suggested taking me to a nearby park, a place he said was quiet and beautiful in the evening. I hesitated, but curiosity and an inexplicable urge won out. When we arrived at the park, the space was enveloped in a misty haze created by the rain. Streetlights cast long, shimmering streaks across the wet ground. Chris led me along a small path to a stone bench beneath an old oak tree. The soft patter of the rain, the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind, created a melodious, almost mystical soundtrack. Chris suddenly stopped, turning to face me. His eyes were deep and filled with sincerity. "Aunt Sarah," he said, his warm voice echoing in the still air. I have something I want to tell you." My heart began to beat faster. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew what was coming. but I couldn't stop it. I've always admired you, Chris continued, his voice trembling slightly. You're an amazing woman, intelligent, kind, and so beautiful. I remained silent, unsure what to say. Chris's words were like honey to my ears, awakening feelings I had buried deep within. I know this might not be right, Chris went on, his voice becoming more earnest, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. I'm in love with you, Aunt Sarah. Chris's confession struck me like a bolt of lightning. I felt stunned, but at the same time, a strange, undeniable happiness bloomed within me. I looked into his eyes, and I saw sincerity, longing, and a hint of fear. Every barrier of reason, of morality, seemed to dissolve within me. I no longer thought of David, of societal norms, of what was right and wrong. I only felt my heart pounding in my chest and a burning desire to be closer to Chris. Chris gently reached out and caressed my cheek. His hand was warm and trembling. I closed my eyes, savoring the tender touch. Then he leaned down, and our lips met. It was a soft, tentative kiss at first, but it quickly deepened into something passionate and consuming. I could feel Chris's warm breath, the sweetness of his lips. I wrapped my arms around him, returning the kiss with equal fervor. The rain continued to fall, but I no longer felt the cold. My body was flushed with warmth, a fire of desire ignited within me. Chris and I exchanged deeper kisses, heated caresses. We were lost in our own world, where only the two of us and our intense emotions existed. My breath hitched, my chest heaving. The kiss, so passionate and consuming, still lingered on my lips. I looked at Chris, his eyes mirroring my own confusion and a touch of fear. We stood in silence, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain and the wind rustling through the trees. That brief moment of uneasy peace was abruptly shattered by a blinding flash of light. Headlights from a car swept across the gazebo, tearing through the darkness. My heart stopped. I whirled around, and I saw David. He stood at the edge of the park, bathed in the dim glow of a streetlight. His face was dark, the veins in his temples throbbing. His eyes, usually so gentle, now burned with anger and hurt. I had never seen him like this before. A chill ran down my spine. I felt as if I'd been doused with ice water. All the sweet sensations, the passionate moments from just moments ago, vanished, replaced by fear and guilt. Chris also saw David. He froze for a few seconds, then slowly released me. His face paled, his eyes widening as he stared at David in horror. The surrounding space became eerily silent. Only the heavy rain and the frantic beating of my heart filled the air. I felt like I was falling, plummeting into a deep, dark abyss. David? I stammered, my voice trembling. I tried to move toward him, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with an expression of utter disappointment. That look was like a knife to my heart, filling me with pain and overwhelming shame. Explain, he finally said, his voice cold and sharp as a razor. Explain what this is. I glanced at Chris. He remained frozen, his face ashen. I knew I had to say something, had to explain, but I didn't know where to begin. I stammered, grasping for words. We were just... Just what? David interrupted, his voice laced with sarcasm. Just talking in the rain? Or were you sharing passionate kisses? I lowered my head, tears beginning to well up in my eyes. I felt terrible, utterly worthless. I had betrayed the man who had trusted me, who had loved me. Chris took a step forward, standing beside me. He looked at David, his voice shaky but trying to remain steady. Uncle David, Quiet, David roared, cutting Chris off. I don't want to hear a word from you. I looked at David, then back at Chris. The two most important men in my life stood there, facing each other, in a moment of suffocating tension. I felt like I was caught in the middle of a storm, with nowhere to run. The feelings of anxiety, fear, guilt, all blended together, making me feel like I was suffocating. I knew my life would change from this moment on, and I didn't know if I could weather this storm. The door slammed shut behind David, the sound echoing through the quiet house like an accusation. I stood frozen in the living room, feeling as though I'd just experienced an earthquake. Everything around me seemed to be shaking, reeling. The rain continued to fall outside, the drumming on the eaves like hammer blows against my heart. I looked around the room. The familiar objects suddenly felt alien. The armchair where I usually sat reading, the coffee table where we used to talk, all seemed to be witnesses to my guilty secret. A wave of self-disgust washed over me, a deep loathing for myself. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, the images of the rainy night and David's disappointed gaze haunting me. I replayed the kiss with Chris in my mind, the passion, the intensity, and the guilt. I knew I was wrong, that I had crossed a moral line, but I couldn't deny the truth of my feelings. The next morning, David got up early as usual. He didn't say a word to me, just quietly made breakfast and left the house. His silence was more terrifying than any accusation could have been. I felt as though an invisible wall had been erected between us, a wall built of betrayal and pain. All day, I lived in a state of torment and remorse. I didn't know how to face David. I wanted to talk to him, to explain everything, but I was terrified. I was afraid of seeing the disappointment in his eyes, of hearing his recriminations, and most of all, I was afraid of losing him. I thought back to the years we'd spent together, the happy memories David and I had shared. We had once been so happy, a perfect couple, but as time passed, our marriage had grown stale, and we had drifted apart. I had been so consumed by my own loneliness that I hadn't realized David was suffering too. I wondered if I was the one who had driven myself into this situation. Had I created the distance between David and me? These questions swirled in my mind, intensifying my guilt and regret. I looked in the mirror and saw a haggard woman with dark circles under her eyes and a tired face. I barely recognized myself. I had lost my confidence, my optimism, and my self-respect. I felt like a sinner, undeserving of love and forgiveness. I knew I had to do something, had to face the truth and take responsibility for my actions. But I didn't know where to begin. The silence between David and me was like a heavy weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I could only sit there in the quiet house, drowning in my torment and guilt, waiting for something to happen. The following days dragged on like an extended nightmare, each day longer than the last, heavy and suffocating. The silence between David and me wasn't simply an absence of sound. It was an invisible wall of ice, separating us into two distinct worlds. We lived under the same roof, but like two strangers trapped in the same space, with no common ground, no connection. He avoided me as if I were something unclean, refusing to touch me, refusing to meet my eyes. His gaze, if it happened to fall on me, was cold and empty, as if he were looking through me, into nothingness. Every meal was eaten in a terrifying silence, the clinking of silverware against plates, sounding sharp as knives stabbing at my heart, a constant reminder of my transgression. I tried to swallow each bite, but my throat constricted, making it nearly impossible to eat. Meals were no longer a time for family connection, but an extended form of mental torture. I knew I had to do something, had to break this wall of silence, but I didn't know where to begin. I wanted to apologize to him, to explain everything, to make him understand, but every time I tried to speak, my throat would tighten, the words trapped in my chest. I feared the judgment in his eyes, feared the dissolution of the marriage I had once cherished, a marriage I had once believed would last forever. I remembered our early days, the romantic evenings, the shared laughter, the promises of a bright future. Now, they were just distant memories, like a beautiful dream that had faded away. I spent most of my time alone in the bedroom, escaping the harsh reality. I gazed out the window, watching the bare branches of the trees sway in the frigid winter wind, mirroring my own soul, empty and alone. My mind was a battlefield, torn between conflicting thoughts, regret and longing, guilt and a yearning for freedom. In my most desperate moments, my thoughts turned to Chris. I remembered his radiant smile, the warm way he looked at me as if I were his entire world. I recalled our kiss in the rain, the intensity, the passion, and the guilt. But above all, I remembered the feeling of reliving my youth, the feeling of being loved and cherished, a feeling I had long lost in this stagnant marriage. The memories of Chris were like a small flame warming my soul in the freezing winter, but at the same time, they burned me with guilt and anxiety. One afternoon, as I was mindlessly reading a book, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. I thought it was David, but when I opened the door, I was completely surprised. No one was there. Just a plain white envelope lying on the doorstep. I picked it up, a tremor running through my body. My name was written neatly on the envelope in a familiar hand. I immediately recognized Chris's writing. I tore open the envelope, a small piece of paper folded into quarters inside. Chris's words stared back at me. "Aunt Sarah, I know things have become very complicated. I'm so sorry for putting you in this difficult position. I know I have no right, but I still want to tell you that I think about you all the time. I know you need time, and I will give you space. But I don't want to give up. If you'd allow it, I'd like to see you again, to talk things through. I'll wait for you at the park, under the old oak tree, on Friday night this week, at 8 o'clock. Chris." I held the letter in my hand, tears welling up in my eyes. I felt a fierce internal conflict. On one hand, I knew I shouldn't meet Chris. This relationship was wrong. It would only bring pain to everyone involved. On the other hand, I couldn't deny my feelings for him, the longing to see him again, to hear his voice. I looked out the window. Darkness had enveloped the garden. Friday night. It was only a few days away. I knew I had to make a decision that would change my life forever. Friday arrived more quickly than I anticipated. For the past few days, I'd been living in a state of limbo, torn between the decision to meet Chris and the fear of the consequences. I had tried to avoid David. Our brief encounters were limited to cold nods and perfunctory greetings. The silence between us was like a wall of ice, growing thicker by the day. By Friday evening, I stood in front of my closet, staring blankly at my clothes. I didn't know what to wear. Part of me wanted to dress up, as if I were preparing for a real date. But another part of me felt guilty, as if I were betraying David all over again. In the end, I chose a charcoal gray sweater and dark jeans. I wanted to look casual, as if I were just going for a walk. When I arrived at the park, it was already dark. Streetlights cast long shadows across the empty paths, creating shimmering streaks on the wet ground. I saw Chris standing beneath the old oak tree, the place where we'd shared our first kiss. My heart pounded in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure, and walked toward him. As he saw me, Chris looked up. His face relaxed into a relieved smile. "Aunt Sarah," he said, his voice warm and low. "Hi, Chris," I replied, my voice slightly trembling. We stood in silence for a moment, neither of us speaking. The surrounding space was quiet, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves. "I'm really glad you came," Chris said, breaking the silence. I don't know," I replied, looking down. "We need to talk," Chris said, his voice serious. We sat down on the stone bench beneath the oak tree. Chris looked at me, his eyes filled with sincerity and concern. "I know things have gone too far," Chris said. I never wanted to hurt you or Uncle David. I couldn't control my feelings. I remained silent, unsure what to say. I knew Chris was telling the truth. I hadn't been able to control my feelings either. I know this is wrong, Chris continued, but I don't regret what happened. I just want you to know that I'm sincere about you. I looked up, meeting Chris's gaze. I saw sincerity, longing, and even a touch of pain in his eyes. I knew I felt the same way. Me too, Chris, I said, my voice choked with emotion. I feel the same way. A long silence followed. We looked at each other, neither of us speaking. Unspoken emotions surged between us. What are we going to do? I asked softly. Chris was silent for a moment, then said, I don't know. I just know I don't want to lose you. I sighed. I knew Chris was right. We were in a difficult situation, with no easy way out. I don't want to lose you either, I said, my voice trembling. But I don't know if we can keep going on like this. Chris looked at me, his eyes filled with hope. We can figure it out, he said. We'll get through this together. I looked at him, and I knew I had to make a decision that would change my life forever. Chris's words echoed in my mind. We can figure it out. But I knew, deep down, that there was no easy path. We were standing at a crossroads, and every choice carried heavy consequences. I returned home that night, the silence between David and me still pervasive. I looked at him. His face was drawn and weary. I knew he was hurting, and a wave of guilt washed over me. Over the next few days, I lived in a constant state of internal conflict. On one hand, I longed to be with Chris, to live authentically with my feelings. On the other hand, I didn't want to hurt David, the man I had spent my youth loving. I was also terrified of social gossip, the judgment of family and friends. I thought a lot about my marriage. I realized that the monotony and loneliness weren't entirely David's fault. I shared some of the responsibility. I had been too passive, had not tried to rekindle the affection between us. Finally, I decided to talk to David. One evening, when he was sitting in the living room reading the newspaper, I went to him and sat down beside him. David, I said, my voice trembling, we need to talk. He looked up at me, his eyes still cold and distant. I told him everything, from my loneliness in our marriage to my meeting with Chris, and even the kiss in the rain. I told him the whole truth, holding nothing back. David listened in silence, his face giving nothing away. When I finished, he looked at me for a long moment, then said, I need time. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I understood. I had inflicted a deep wound, and it would take time to heal. In the days that followed, nothing changed. David remained silent and distant. I knew he was thinking, weighing things in his mind. I could only wait and hope. As for Chris, I had texted him, telling him that I needed time to sort things out. He understood and respected my decision. A few weeks later, David called me into the living room. He handed me a piece of paper. It was a divorce decree. I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. I knew this was for the best for both of us. We were no longer meant to be together. I signed the papers, a wave of loss and grief washing over me. But I also felt a flicker of relief. I knew I needed to move on, to start a new life. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Chris and I could ever be together. But I knew I had learned a valuable lesson. I had learned to love myself more, to value my own feelings, and to bravely face the truth. I looked out the window. The morning sun was streaming into the garden. A new day was beginning. I know what I did was wrong. I shouldn't have had any kind of affair with Chris. I shouldn't have hurt David, the man who was once my entire world. But I'm only human. I couldn't bear the monotony, the loneliness that was eating away at my soul in this marriage. It made my life feel pointless, like an old movie playing on repeat every day. No climaxes, no surprises, just dull repetition. I sought an escape, a glimmer of hope, even though I knew the path I chose was fraught with thorns and tears. I've asked myself 1,000 times, can I ever forgive myself? Will David ever forgive me? And most importantly, did I do the right thing? I don't have the answers. I only know that I made a choice, a painful and difficult one. I know my story might be controversial. Some will condemn me, saying I deserve to be punished. Others will sympathize with me, understanding the turmoil in my soul. And perhaps there are those who have gone through similar situations, who understand the challenges I'm facing. I'm not looking for judgment. I simply wanted to share my story, a part of my life, hoping to find some empathy and understanding. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Which path would you choose? Please let me know. I genuinely want to hear your thoughts and perspectives. Thank you.